Death was supposed to be final, yet here she was, breathing through another woman's lungs, seeing through eyes that weren't her own. The dead girl's father stood before her, his face contorted with rage, and all she could think was, "Whose body am I wearing?" She couldn't breathe, not at first. The girl struggled for air, her consciousness swimming through murky confusion as she forced her eyes open. Nothing about her surroundings made sense. Looking down at her hands, she felt a profound sense of wrongness. These delicate fingers belonged to someone else. The skin was too pale, the nails too perfectly manicured. A stranger's hands attached to what was apparently now her body. Before she could process this realization, rough hands seized her arm. A man's face, twisted with fury, appeared before her. His rage was palpable as he berated her for ruining their family's great cause, for jumping into water the day before her wedding. He called her Haley repeatedly, each utterance of the name landing like a physical blow. The girl's mind reeled with shock. Haley? That wasn't her name. But if she wasn't Haley, then who was she? Years earlier, in a different life, another girl faced her own struggles. The classroom fell silent as attention turned toward a girl sitting alone in the corner. Kangi Ji, they called her. The teacher's exasperation was evident in her slumped shoulders and weary expression as she confronted the girl about speaking to things no one else could see. Kangi Ji's eyes remained fixed on the empty space beside the teacher's desk, insisting she could see something dreadful there. Her classmates' whispers spread through the room like poison, suggestions of possession and unfortunate destiny following her as they always did. Such rumors eventually led her to a shaman in Cheongnam, who scrutinized her with cold, judgmental eyes before declaring there was no sign of luck on her face. The shaman dismissed the possibility that such a plain girl could receive a spirit, advising her to stick to minimal tasks. That was all she was good for. This had always been Kangi Ji's reality. Abandoned at birth, burdened with the ability to see what others couldn't, she survived only through the kindness of Grandma Yangan and whatever odd jobs she could find. Her gift was her curse, isolating her in a world that couldn't understand. As the memories of Kangi Ji faded like mist, the present situation came back into sharp focus. The man, Duke Duncan, Haley's father, continued his furious tirade. His face had turned crimson with anger as he accused her of destroying a golden opportunity for both their families. Kangi Ji, somehow now inhabiting Haley's body, scanned the unfamiliar surroundings with mounting panic. Nothing looked familiar. Her mind raced with questions as she wondered if she was possessed by someone named Haley. But the deeper she reached into this borrowed consciousness, the more certain she became that there was no trace of Haley remaining. Instead, fragmented memories began surfacing, memories that weren't hers, all seemingly centered around water. A chilling realization washed over her. Haley had taken her own life in water. Enough time had passed that Haley's soul should have either transformed into a vengeful spirit or vanished completely. This wasn't possession. Kangi Ji had somehow inherited the body of someone who had already died. Just as the past had shaped Kangi Ji's life through isolation, the present threatened to drown her in consequences for actions she hadn't committed. The Duke's tirade was interrupted by another presence. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly as a handsome young man entered. The Duke's demeanor transformed from rage to reverence as he acknowledged his king. The newcomer surveyed the scene with cold calculation, questioning the Duke's treatment of his daughter before dismissing him to speak with his fiancée privately. The collision of past and present became complete as Kangi Ji's old gift manifested in her new reality. As Kangi Ji recognized the man from Haley's memories, the king of this country and Haley's fiancé, her blood ran cold for a different reason. Surrounding him was a swarm of vengeful spirits, more than she had ever seen around one person. She collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by their presence and the implications of what this man must have done to attract so many restless souls. The king noticed her reaction, approaching with measured steps and questioning her fear. Without thinking, Kangi Ji admitted that anyone would tremble after seeing such spirits, immediately regretting her honesty. His expression hardened as he informed her that despite her crime being worthy of death, he hadn't come to kill her, at least not yet. The gravity of the situation crashed over her like a physical blow. Haley had committed suicide before the royal wedding, causing an immense scandal. Now Kangi Ji was trapped in the dead girl's body, facing consequences for someone else's final desperate act. As the spirits of Kangi Ji's past merged with the ghosts haunting her present, she found herself at the intersection of two doomed fates. To her surprise, her honest admission about trembling at his words brought a brief smile to the king's face. He studied her with newfound interest, noting that they had barely exchanged 3 words before today. Something in his manner shifted slightly, suggesting that perhaps this strange encounter was not proceeding as he had expected. The king's gaze lingered on her face, as if seeing something new in the features he thought he knew. For Kangi Ji, trapped in Haley's body and surrounded by Haley's problems, this moment of genuine curiosity from the spirit-haunted king might be her only hope, or the beginning of an even greater nightmare. The king's eyes narrowed as he questioned whether the prospect of marriage was truly so unbearable that it drove Haley to end her life. He reminded her with cutting precision that it was the Duncan family who had proposed the union in the first place. His tone sharpened as he demanded an answer, warning that he disliked asking twice. Desperate and confused, Kangi Ji pleaded that she didn't know. Haley's memories remained fragmented in her mind. Even if Haley had once wished for death, Kangi Ji herself did not. She insisted that her actions, or rather, Haley's actions, weren't driven by hatred for the marriage. The king, skeptical, questioned if her despair was due to another man. Kangi Ji was stunned by the suggestion. Her own life had contained no such entanglements, but Haley Duncan's life clearly had different complications. In this moment, the chasm between Kangi Ji's past and Haley's present grew wider, the two lives she now carried becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. The king dismissed the notion with cold indifference, stating that he couldn't care less if her heart belonged to another man. In fact, he would gladly support her affections. However, he refused to let history remember him as an even more ill-fated king. Confused by his words, Kangi Ji found herself trapped in his piercing blue gaze as he delivered his final judgment. He declared that she must live longer than she desires, and if she truly wished to die, she must do so wearing the crown. Gripping her chin, he left no room for argument. Shaken to her core, Kangi Ji reflected on her past with Grandma Yangan. It seemed that no matter where she went, she was destined to live an unfortunate life. First as the orphan who saw ghosts, and now as a reluctant royal bride. As the king's ultimatum hung in the air, memories of Grandma Yangan's teachings came flooding back, bridging the gap between Kangi Ji's former life and her current predicament. Grandma Yangan, who had taken her in, was a renowned shaman. She had always warned Kangi Ji to stay away from water, extremely cautious about avoiding harm from spirits. She remained very selective about visitors and spoke sparingly, repeatedly ordering Kangi Ji to avoid seas, valleys, or any water bodies. Since she constantly emphasized avoiding water, it was clear that her warnings carried significant weight. Grandma Yangan believed that no matter how unfortunate life might be, one should live long and stubbornly. Therefore, Kangi Ji had spent her life avoiding such dangers. Yet fate has a cruel sense of irony, twisting the threads of destiny into unexpected patterns. When she came to her senses, she found herself in the body of someone who had thrown herself into water, the very thing she had been warned against her entire life. Now she faced a man who carried a legion of tormented spirits, and to make matters worse, he expected her to become the king's consort. As the king calmly informed her that she should die wearing the crown, he added that if she wished to refuse, this would be her only chance. The offer would not be extended again. Kangi Ji realized that the dreadful spirits were watching her silently, awaiting her answer. She grew anxious, knowing she had to avoid making eye contact with them. Gathering her courage, she asked if she could pose just one question, to which the king nodded. Hesitantly, she asked what would happen if she refused. The king explained that the official reason for postponing the wedding was the bride contracting a severe flu. If she refused, however, the story would change. It would be as though she had succumbed to a deadly illness instead. As he smiled, he coldly stated that her refusal would mean death. The realization sent a chill through her. She questioned what kind of unfair choices these were, while the king found her reaction rather amusing. He pressed her for an answer, asking if she would rather jump into the water again. Without hesitation, Kangi Ji shook her head, asserting that the answer was obvious: she wanted to live. Resolutely, she declared that she would never give up on her life, absolutely not. At least, not until she wore the crown. She promised herself it would not happen. In that moment, her choice was made. The orphan girl who had always clung to life would continue to do so, even in this strange new existence. The king stepped closer, stating that he would try to believe her, though his expression revealed complete disbelief. Kangi Ji understood his skepticism. It was hard to trust someone who had apparently attempted to end her life the previous day. The king smiled faintly and muttered that he would overlook his fiancée's mistake, shocking Kangi Ji as she realized he had read her thoughts. Turning to his official, the king ordered him to summon Duke Duncan. The official promptly obeyed, and the duke soon stood before the king, taken aback by the summons. Inwardly, the duke cursed, furious that someone dared to command him as though they owned his estate. The king addressed the duke with a stern warning. Duke Duncan's daughter would soon become the Queen of Kain, just as he had wished. This meant she was no longer someone the duke could treat as he pleased. If he dared raise his hand against her again, he would find himself facing consequences far beyond his imagination. The duke clenched his fists in anger, struggling to contain his rage. Meanwhile, Kangi Ji noticed the vague spirits surrounding the king chanting, "Kill, kill, kill him." The evil energy they radiated was overwhelming, something no ordinary person could endure. It dawned on her that the king truly might kill the duke if this continued. As the king fought to suppress his instincts, he barely managed to restrain himself, muttering that he was losing control once again. Finally, the king sheathed his sword and asked the duke if he had made his decision. The duke, visibly shaken, affirmed his choice. Kangi Ji found the entire situation absurd. Any ordinary person would have lost their sanity by now. Yet the king had managed to hold himself together through sheer willpower. The collision of these two powerful men, both surrounded by their own dark histories, left Kangi Ji caught in the middle of a storm she never asked to enter. Extending his hand toward her, the king reminded Kangi Ji that she was still kneeling. She accepted his hand, allowing him to help her stand. To her surprise, he lifted her hand and kissed it, stating that 4 days should be sufficient for her to recover from the flu. He addressed her as, "my love," prompting a reluctant affirmation. Turning back to the duke, the king announced that the wedding would take place in 4 days. Since the scandal had already spread far and wide, he saw no reason to delay further. He declared that this would be his final act of mercy toward the duke and his family. Without waiting for a response, he embraced Kangi Ji and smiled, encouraging her to do her best from this moment onward. He called her Haley Duncan and ordered her to walk toward him alive and well, and return to the castle. The king then ordered some knights to guard the duke's estate until the wedding, ensuring the duke would not dare to raise his hand against her again. Furious, the duke clenched his fists and gritted his teeth, his anger barely contained. Kangi Ji, observing the scene unfold, was struck by a realization. This man, the king of Kain, Rodri Ferris Blake, was somehow still alive despite bearing such immense karma and resentment. It left her with one lingering question. Who exactly was he? The days passed like water through cupped hands, and before Kangi Ji could fully comprehend her new reality, the future she had been thrust into arrived. 4 days had passed in the blink of an eye, and the wedding day had finally arrived. As the guests gathered, whispers filled the air, with many expressing disbelief that the wedding was actually happening. They murmured about how they had expected something to go wrong once again, given the bride's history of misfortunes before every wedding. Another noble mentioned that Duke Duncan was known as the scariest person and had been the one to push his daughter into this situation. Kangi Ji, upon hearing this, reflected that the story existed within Haley's memory. While her own memories remained incomplete and riddled with gaps, she could still recall that the king had previously adhered strictly to arranged marriages with only one condition. The bride had to come from a minor noble family with no ambition for power. He had no desire to strengthen his position through powerful in-laws. As the whispers continued, people recalled how the first bride had died in an accident, and the second had succumbed to poison. It was only with the third bride, Haley, that the king had seemingly succeeded. Kangi Ji found it hard to believe that the third attempt had also ended in failure. Knowing the truth, the real Haley had jumped into the water, and only she held that knowledge. The ghosts of the past, both literal and figurative, seemed to hang over the wedding preparations, invisible to all but Kangi Ji, A knock sounded at the door, and Rodri called out, asking if she had enjoyed a good dream, reminding her that it had been her last night at the mansion. He remarked that the place hardly seemed worth missing, to which Kangi Ji calmly affirmed that it had been a fine night. She found it surprising that nothing unusual seemed to loom over the day, considering the number of vengeful spirits she had previously encountered. It puzzled her why they were nowhere to be seen. Rodri approached her, and as she observed him more closely, she couldn't help but acknowledge how striking his features were, something that stirred her envy. Realizing that she had been staring too intently, she quickly turned her face away, chastising herself for being so obvious. Rodri remarked that she had made him speak several times already today, prompting her to apologize for her nervousness. However, Rodri dismissed her words, expressing his dislike for lies and pointing out that she did not appear nervous in the slightest. Flustered, Kangi Ji denied his claim, arguing that if His Majesty perceived her as nervous, it must be true, before catching her mistake and correcting herself. Her reaction seemed to amuse Roderick, who found her behavior particularly intriguing. Kangi Ji explained that she was merely being cautious with her words, considering His Majesty's noble status. She admitted that she did not know him personally, and if she spoke carelessly, she would undoubtedly make mistakes. When Rodri did not immediately respond, Kangi Ji wondered if she had been too candid. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of their unusual circumstances. As the wedding hour approached, Kangi Ji found herself balancing between two lives. The one she had lived and the one she had inherited, wondering which path would lead her through the coming storm. Rodri finally acknowledged her explanation, stating that he understood her perspective. Their moment of connection was interrupted by another knock at the door, as an attendant announced that it was time to prepare. Rodri affirmed the instruction, calling for Haley to follow, and she silently agreed to abide by it. As they walked down the aisle, Kangi Ji couldn't help but reflect on how habits could be truly frightening. She had never worn such high heels or cumbersome clothing before, yet she moved with surprising ease. The sensation of the wind brushing against her skin made her pause, prompting her to wonder where it was coming from. A sudden chill ran through her body, and she questioned whether it was the presence of some energy. Looking up, she was taken aback by the sight of a spirit, a presence far more grand and imposing than any she had ever encountered. Between the world of the living and that of spirits, Kangi Ji's existence had always been a bridge. But this bridge now seemed to span across two lifetimes, two identities, and two destinies. Though Rodri called out to her, Kangi Ji found herself unable to hear him clearly. She instinctively understood that this was neither a minor nor an evil spirit. It was something of a much higher status. As the spirit's gaze fell upon her, she shuddered and quickly averted her eyes, reminding herself not to betray any sign of recognition. Rodri's voice broke the tense silence as he called out for Haley Duncan, questioning why she was hesitating. Kangi Ji apologized for being silent and assured him that she was moving forward. The world, she realized, had grown strange and frightening. Vengeful spirits roamed freely, and she had to remain exceedingly cautious. As the wedding ceremony progressed through its solemn rituals, elsewhere in the palace, different machinations were unfolding. The scene shifted to the evening, where a knight asked Rodri what His Majesty truly thought of her. Rodri admitted that he was uncertain. The knight pointed out that someone in Rodri's position would naturally need to remain close to her, prompting Rodri to chuckle. He remarked that despite her youth and connection to the Duncan family, things could not be so straightforward. He dismissed the idea as nonsense, addressing the knight as Jade, head of the First Knights. Rodri then observed that the situation did not seem as naive as rumors had suggested. Jade, in turn, questioned whether the recent incidents truly stemmed from the actions of a particular individual. Rodri, intrigued, asked what he meant. Jade elaborated, referring to the deaths of the two previous fiancés of His Majesty. He mentioned the suspicions surrounding Haley Duncan and Haley Duncan's father, questioning whether the reports had indeed indicated that they were responsible for the killings. Rodri fell into contemplation, silently considering the implications as he called for Duke Duncan without further comment. Rodri pondered over it, questioning if the previous two fiancés hadn't been murdered, would he have ever created such a powerful in-law as Duncan? While Kangi Ji navigated the treacherous waters of her new existence, the currents of politics and suspicion ran deep beneath the surface of the royal court. Since Duke Duncan had been openly trying to become an in-law of the royal family, the probability of him being the culprit was the highest. Yet Duncan's daughter had ended up jumping into the water, and she wasn't murdered. However, she had no intention of becoming a queen, and that fact alone didn't clear her father of suspicion. For now, Rodri needed to keep an eye on Duncan's family and find a way to use Haley Duncan as favorable assets. As Rodri's thoughts lingered, Jade questioned if he was planning on having more and suggested that he should leave now. Rodri retorted, asking if Jade was worried that he might abandon the bride on the first night, before urging him to hurry up and follow. As Jade poured the alcohol, he commented that while he asked Rodri not to be too harsh, the queen was still young, and the young lady was caught up in the king and the duke's chess game. Rodri countered, stating that such a remark was unsuitable for his position. As the lady was merely a pawn in Duncan's game, she was still under Duncan's influence. Rodri instructed Jade to send someone to the queen's quarters to maintain strict surveillance. Jade affirmed the order, assuring Rodri not to worry about it. Rodri gulped down his drink, announcing that he was leaving, and since it was so close, he told Jade not to follow him. As Jade watched Rodri's face, he noted that Rodri looked fine today and wondered if the madness had subsided. After all, the king had been suffering from a nervous breakdown and severe insomnia. Rumors had begun circulating about the king's madness, and it had reached a point where putting him to sleep had become nearly impossible. Jade silently hoped that things would remain as calm as they were now. As the palace settled into the quiet rhythms of night, two strangers bound by fate and ceremony found themselves facing an uncertain first evening together. The scene shifted as Rodri walked down the hallway, only for the vengeful spirits to envelop him once again. Despite others noting his stable condition earlier, here it was again, the splitting headache returning with full force. Meanwhile, Kangi Ji questioned if her nightwear was too thin. She reflected that she had never worn such revealing clothes. Even when she lived as Kangi Ji, it wasn't that she absolutely opposed the idea, rather, it seemed like an opportunity. After all, virgin spirits and bachelor spirits were particularly vengeful. She wondered how important such matters were in their lives and questioned what sin being single could carry to haunt someone even after death. Determined, she cheered herself up, steeling her resolve. Rodri suddenly questioned what was wrong, startling Kangi Ji and making her wonder when he had entered the room. Rodri calmly stated that he was merely raising his head. Kangi Ji, seeing the vengeful spirits around him, realized that things had taken a dark turn once again. It had seemed fine during the day, and unless Rodri had visited a battlefield or graveyard, such a scene should have been impossible. Observing Kangi Ji's expression, Rodri remarked that she was the queen and that the duke was remarkably diligent about disposing of his children. He approached Kangi Ji, causing her to shudder, but instead of advancing further, he sat beside the bed. Kangi Ji, now standing, wondered how to handle the situation and found the atmosphere awkward as she sat beside Rodri. The boundary between the living and the dead seemed to blur in this moment, as the spirit's hunger for vengeance threatened to consume the very man who had promised her protection. Attempting to break the silence, Kangi Ji hesitantly asked if Rodri was all right. However, seeing the vengeful spirits glaring at him, she silently prayed not to attract their attention. She urged Rodri to get a hold of himself, realizing that his consciousness had already been seized. Desperate, she shook him, reminding him that he had endured too much to give in now. Flinching from the pain, Rodri momentarily snapped out of his daze, and Kangi Ji realized her voice had reached him. Rodri collapsed onto her lap, and she questioned if he had fallen asleep, noting his lack of response. Kangi Ji observed that Rodri seemed to have calmed down, and she couldn't help but notice his striking features, a fortunate nose and chin, a strong bone structure so unlike her own. Moreover, despite his weakened state, his inherent energy remained tremendous. It reminded her of the Western ghost seen at the wedding, a similar aura, almost divine. She concluded that someone like Rodri shouldn't be tainted by vengeful spirits and wondered why fate had placed him in such a predicament. Drawing on the wisdom of her former life, Kangi Ji faced a choice: to remain a passive observer or to use her unique gifts to intervene. Kangi Ji recalled the old woman's teachings. If one becomes conscious of spirits, the spirits in turn become conscious of them. Involving oneself with the other world invites it into one's life. Kangi Ji resolved not to let that happen. She gently laid Rodri down on the bed, contemplating how even a fate as fortunate as his could worsen. Yet she reminded herself that this person had protected her from Duke Duncan, who had once struck her. After all, she was just an ordinary person who could see ghosts, learning only through observation. Involvement with spirits brought nothing but harm. Nevertheless, she decided that as a reward for Rodri's kindness, it should be acceptable to help just this once. Summoning a circle, she cast a spell, ensuring that at least tonight, Rodri could sleep soundly, free from the torment of vengeful spirits. As the spell was cast and the mysterious air enveloped her, Kangi Ji focused it on the vengeful spirits. The spirits grew furious, giggling as they mocked her for looking their way. Without hesitation, Kangi Ji ripped part of her cloth, biting her finger to smear blood onto the fabric. She wondered if this method would work here, since dealing with ghosts ultimately came down to a battle of will. Quickly, she wrote symbols on the makeshift talisman, chanting that time flows differently between the living world and the afterlife, and the two realms can never truly mix. She called the spirits impure beings and commanded them to return to where they belonged. In this moment, the orphan girl who had once been shunned for her abilities found purpose in them, wielding her curse as a shield for the man who now held her fate in his hands. As the vengeful aura dissipated into thin air, Kangi Ji breathed heavily, questioning if it was finally over. But then a sharp throb ran through her head. She realized she hadn't truly saved them, she had only temporarily driven the spirits away. They would undoubtedly return soon. Hiding a talisman under the bed, she turned to Rodri, thinking that at least he would be able to sleep soundly tonight. As exhaustion washed over her, she lay down beside him, quietly promising herself that she would repay this favor somehow. The next morning, as the faint light of dawn filtered through the window, Kangi Ji stirred, only to find Rodri staring at her. He called her name, questioning if she was awake. Embarrassment flooded her body, and she quickly sat up, flustered by his gaze. Rodri, amused by her exaggerated reaction, raised an eyebrow. Kangi Ji stammered, asking why he was looking at her like that, to which Rodri calmly pointed at her exposed leg. Horrified, Kangi Ji immediately covered herself, while Rodri chuckled, questioning if he was responsible for this situation. He admitted he didn't remember anything wild happening last night. Kangi Ji reassured him, saying he fell asleep almost immediately, not that she was complaining about nothing happening. As morning light dispelled the shadows of the night, Kangi Ji found herself navigating yet another new terrain, the aftermath of a wedding night that never truly was. The light streaming through the windows cast a gentle glow on the room, illuminating the path ahead. For Kangi Ji, trapped in Haley's body and bound to Rodri's fate, the journey had only just begun. The spirits would return, the Duke would plot, and the chess game would continue. But for now, in this peaceful moment between night and day, she had earned a brief respite. She had protected the king from his tormentors, if only for a night. And perhaps, in doing so, she had taken the first step toward understanding her new purpose in this strange and dangerous world. As Rodri handed her something, their fingers brushed, and for a moment, Kangi Ji wondered if perhaps there was more to this arrangement than mere political machinations. The orphan who saw ghosts and the king haunted by vengeful spirits, two souls touched by the otherworld, now bound together by circumstances neither could have foreseen. Whatever trials lay ahead, Kangi Ji knew one thing for certain. She would face them with the same stubborn determination that had kept her alive through her first life. And perhaps, in this second chance, she might find a way not just to survive, but to thrive.